My name is Summer Lindman, and I am the head of customer success at Talkable. And today I'm going to focus on the phases of building out a customer health score. But before I do that, I wanted to give you just a little bit of background on what Talkable is, what we do. We're a referral marketing platform, mostly for e-commerce companies. We were founded in 2012. We have just over 70 employees, both in offices in San Francisco, where I'm from, as well as here in Kiev. And we have over 200 customers, mostly focused on the enterprise, Saks Fifth Avenue, Moda Operandi, American Eagle, and Society6 are sort of our big names. So why do we need a customer health score? And maybe before I ask that question, by a show of hands, who in the room has a customer health score that they work with internally or grade their customers in some way? Okay, a few. Awesome. And so for the rest of you, you might be then asking yourself this question: why do we need a customer health score? And these are kind of long, wordy quotes that I won't read through for you today. But basically, the gist of it is that a customer health score is something that you can utilize internally, both to prevent churn and to predict churn. And there's a lot of debate as to whether or not it should be focused around leading indicators of churn. It could be something to help your customer success team internally to be more efficient with your customers. And it can also be focused on lagging indicators to actually predict churn closer to their renewal date. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that and kind of what my personal opinion is, but maybe just as an introduction, think right now, how would you look at customer health internally and how would you want to use this score? So to start, one size does not fit all. Each and every one of you have different businesses, you have different functions and roles that you work in, and creating one customer health score internally is probably not a good idea. Mostly because obviously your customers are different. You might have different customer lifecycle stages. A customer who's in either a proof of concept or a pilot phase will have very different indicators of success versus a customer who you've worked with for 2, 3, 4 years. Service tier is another way to segment your customer base. If a customer is paying you only a nominal amount and is more of a self-service customer, they're also going to have different factors of success. Business segment is another way, and of course, industry. So phase number 1, defining customer health. I'll tell you a little bit about the journey that we went through in defining customer health at Talkable. I've been with that company for 3 years, and when I first started, our CEO came to me and he was very excited. He was like, your first job, fresh out of business school as I was, is to define customer health internally and build a customer health scorecard. And at the time I was like, awesome, great, this is super easy. I'll just put some red, yellow, green, some charts together. I'll look at our 50 customers that we had at the time, and it'll be a simple task. What I quickly learned, however, is that it's not a simple task. There are lots of layers to looking at customer health, lots of different things that you can consider. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, and I hope that there will be some helpful tips and tricks for all of you, even those that already define customer health internally. So what's the outcome I'm trying to achieve? I already asked this question. Is it to predict churn, or is it to focus your CSMs or your account managers or sales team on the right accounts? And I'm going to argue that it's both. I think initially you should be building out your customer health score, focusing on these leading indicators, focusing on getting your team to focus on those right accounts. However, if you get it right, if you're actually able to define these early risk indicators of customer health, you'll eventually have a churn prediction model as well. So deciding what customer health actually means, as I mentioned, we had used this initial red, yellow, green model. There's also a numerical health score that you can build out, or an A through F. It doesn't really matter, is my point. Pick something that works for you and kind of start there. So defining the categories, this was a screenshot of what we actually used initially at Talkable. So we had gone to a meetup in San Francisco, and Boaz Mayor was the guy who actually put this initial framework together. And we were like, that looks awesome. We'll just create some categories. We'll define a bunch of different metrics within those categories. And eventually we ended up with an Excel spreadsheet that was 50 columns long. And we were looking at so many different factors, we were quite overwhelmed. We all kind of sat in a room and went through every single customer manually, and I had every customer success manager there to go through and say, okay, how do you think the customer is doing on adoption? Are they logging into our product? Are they using our A/B testing suite? Are they running reports? And very quickly, we were just getting pretty overwhelmed and realized it wasn't a scalable way to do it. So I've listed out for you some things to think about, qualitative versus quantitative as you define these metrics. My recommendation based on my experience is really to start small. Choose 5 or 6 of these. And again, focus on those more leading indicators. It's going to depend on your business, obviously, but some ideas are overall product usage, and within that, what are your stickiest features that customers should be using? If you think about who is the most successful customer that's using our product right now, what are the features that they're using that make them successful? License utilization, pretty obvious. If a customer is paying you money every month and not using your product, that's probably a pretty good sign that they're not going to stick around for long. Support tickets, are they reaching out often, reporting bugs? And what's important here is actually not just the number of support tickets being put in, but your response to those. Are you responding quickly? Are you actually fixing things? Or is this client getting continually frustrated because they've now reached out 50 times and nothing's happened? NPS and CSAT, this is something that I go back and forth on. I think by the time a customer gives you a low CSAT or NPS score, most likely they're already making up their mind. But this again goes back to how do you respond to this? If you're reaching out immediately after the customer gives you a low NPS score or a low CSAT score and actually try to remedy some of their concerns, this can be a good way for you to actually improve that health score. Contact shift, if you have one main contact, one internal champion who is the decision maker or who is the user of your product, this is pretty risky if they leave, which leads me to the next one, which is executive engagement and executive alignment. If you don't have another secondary contact that's engaged with you, then if one of them leaves, you're in big trouble. Reference calls, another one that's pretty obvious. If a customer is constantly giving reference calls on your behalf, then they are pretty highly engaged. And of course, product feedback. And this, again, can be questionable if the product feedback is positive or if it's negative. But even if it's negative, if you're actively engaging with them and saying, okay, let's dig into that, we'll get this on the product roadmap, it can be another opportunity to improve that customer health. And then leading versus lagging indicators, already touched on this, but some other options here. ROI or business results, how is your product being measured on the customer side? Is it a positive return on investment, obviously, and if not, what can you do to improve that? Profitability, this is one that might not be as obvious. Often we think about how is the customer performing, how are we appearing to them, but also how is the customer appearing to you? If the customer is ultimately not profitable for you, no matter how happy they are, no matter how successful or high their customer health score is, you're going to run into some issues further down the line. And then overall customer business health, this is actually the customer itself. If they've recently been acquired or you notice that their sales are declining month over month, it's a more lagging indicator, but it's also probably not a good sign in terms of the vendors that they're working with. Regular payments, again, after they've missed 3 bills, another lagging indicator that you're going to say, okay, how much longer are they going to keep paying us? And then growth of the account, if they've continued to expand their seats or licenses year over year, a pretty positive indicator that they're happy and that the account's growing. And length of time as a customer. Depending on what your lifetime value is, hopefully it's indefinite. We all hope that. But if you've had a customer that's worked with you for 3 and 4 years, usually that renewal is a little easier depending on all the other factors. So endless possibilities, as I just mentioned. There's a long list there to just start with. There's many other things that you can be looking at, and they are specific to your business. But start with what you know. So putting this into action, starting small, like I said, consider all the elements that first make your clients successful. I mean, typically your customer success managers or account managers should know instinctively at least the 1 or 2 things that, yes, every client that's successful with us does X. And so get them all in a room, try to understand what those things are. And then on the opposite side, think of what makes a client unsuccessful. Of all the customers that have recently churned or gone dormant, what are the signs or what are the actions that they're actually taking that lead to that? Choose no more than 6 categories. Like I said, you don't want to be us and end up with 50 different indicators. And the reason for that is because if you get it wrong, it's super hard to go back and try to figure out where you got it wrong. With 5 or 6 categories, you can say, okay, we can now pinpoint maybe, oh, let's swap out this one for this one. And so it's all about iterating. And the prioritization is also important. We put weights with all of the different factors. If there's 1 or 2 things that are really the indicators of success for your company, and maybe 3, 4, 5 secondary elements, you might want to add weights into those. And do you have access to the data? This is an important conversation if you're eventually going to push this data into Salesforce or actually try to automate a health score that's being updated regularly. You need to think about where the data lives, if it's quantitative or if it's qualitative. Another learning for us at Talkable was about 6 months after we created that initial health score. Our CEO was like, cool, let's buy a customer success automation tool, which at the time I was like, that sounds amazing. However, we quickly learned because that data wasn't A, clearly specified, and B, wasn't actually anywhere where we could access it. A lot of our product data was living far away, not somewhere where I had immediate access to it, so we had to first get all of that pushed into Salesforce. And then second, there was a lot of qualitative data that we also weren't tracking anywhere. So we first needed to assess where can we put all of this, and then how often can we update it? And those were some key learnings, because when you start to spend $5,000 and $6,000 a month on a software that you're not using, it becomes pretty painful. And then how often will I be able to update this? Like I said, what we actually initially did for the first few months was get in a room and do this once per quarter. But depending on the factors that you choose, that might not be frequent enough to update it. And then, like I already mentioned, is this data quantifiable? So here is just a screenshot of our initial one. As you can imagine, this just kept going for columns and columns, and ultimately spit out this, lovely CHS, or customer health score, and we were very proud of it at the time. However, what we also quickly learned was that what's the difference between someone with a 95.86 and an 80.49? Is there a difference, and what are the actions that are actually supposed to be taken? So what's next? Involving those CSMs, like I said, and building out this first version, this MVP, is super critical. And then making sure that there's a playbook. So that's what I was alluding to in that last section, is if there's not a clear identifiable action for your customer success managers or account managers to take with the change of a score, then it's not going to be useful. The whole idea is that the score will turn from 70 down to 30, and immediately the customer success manager is like, oh, got it. They didn't pay their bill. I need to follow up, or whatever the actual event is that happens. And then who gets notified when the score changes? So this is also something to think about. Initially, you might just think, okay, it just needs to be the customer success manager. But depending on your business and how many clients you have, it might also need to be an executive on the team. And it might actually also be your customer. So this is the next one. How do you use the score internally and with your customers? Ideally, if this is a true indication of health, both on the customer side and an indicator of their success, you might want to share this with your customer and say to them, oh, hey, we noticed that your score went down to a 20. It's actually because you stopped using this particular feature. Why is that? And try to uncover what changed on their side. So review, revise, and repeat. Obviously, this is a pretty long journey. You can't just start with one iteration and then think, cool, it's done. Cross it off the list. It's an always evolving process. It's going to change as your customers change. It's also going to change as you release new product features, as you're analyzing kind of the different success factors that happen with your customers. So try it again, and keep revising. It's probably an ever-evolving process. I would say after 3 years, we're still continuing to change our customer health score. So key questions to ask, I think, especially after that initial try, you've tested it for a few months with your customers, is, are we getting a lot of false positives or false negatives? If your customer success managers are coming to you and saying, so this account has a 20, but I know for sure they should be a 100. They're super involved. They just did a reference call for me yesterday. That's not great, because obviously there's something broken in the model. And on the opposite side, obviously, if the client or the score is saying 100 and they're like, no, they're definitely churning, they actually already told me, then there's obviously something wrong. Is the process scalable? If you're starting with kind of 6 things, and you can then think about automation, and you can even add in other factors as you go along, then you obviously have a pretty good foundation for scaling it, and automation as well. And then are each of the metrics something that the team can influence? You don't want to be choosing things that at the end of the day there's either no clear playbook or there's no way for them to influence. Otherwise, you're just going to have a lot of stressed out and frustrated customer success managers. And then, of course, is the prioritization correct? Especially after that initial one, you do want to go back and say, maybe we put too much weight into one and not another. And then are we looking at the right elements? Obviously. So you have to start somewhere. You might be overwhelmed with the process of giving you a lot of lists and a lot of things to think about. But in general, this process can open up kind of a world of possibilities, both for, I would say, everyone on the team. I think a lot of times the customer health lives in the customer success team. And if those of you who have customer success teams might think, oh yeah, they're responsible for retention or they're responsible for customer health, but it really is a company-wide initiative and should be looked at by everyone because retention is ultimately a lagging indicator and you need to look at those inputs. And engagement and customer health is all a part of that. And actually by doing this process internally for us, we found out a lot of things about customers that we didn't even necessarily realize. We initially hypothesized, oh, they're using these 3 features and that what gives them the most value. But we quickly learned that there were lots of other things that they were doing that we weren't really aware of that were giving them a lot more value. So if there's anything that you take away from today's conversation, it is first, starting small, like I said, no more than 6 categories. Keep in mind what you already know. I know it seems obvious, but I can't tell you how many times I talk to other colleagues who have gone through this process, and they're like, we just started with a laundry list of stuff, and we didn't even think about who our most successful customers are to begin with. Focus on those leading indicators, and focus on then the customer health initially, and that will transform and turn into a more accurate churn prediction over time. You have to start somewhere, and then review, revise, and repeat. So thank you.